Two people say goodbye at a door. They lean in. Foreheads or noses nearly touch, a brief pause hanging in the air. Then contact. Nobody explains this moment to anyone else standing nearby. Nobody has to. It's one of the most instantly recognizable gestures in existence anywhere on the planet. And yet, if you actually ask a biologist to explain exactly why humans do this, the honest, slightly uncomfortable answer is that we're still not entirely sure. There's no other animal behavior quite like it, no single universally agreed upon evolutionary reason behind it, and this is the part that genuinely surprises almost everyone who hears it for the first time. It might not even be as universal or as ancient as you've always simply assumed it to be. What follows will take that one small familiar gesture apart, piece by piece, and put it back together as something considerably stranger than a simple expression of affection. Here's the finding that genuinely appends the whole assumption most people walk in with. A large cross-cultural study, reviewing more than 160 documented societies around the world, found that romantic, mouth-to-mouth kissing was clearly present as a recognized named custom in fewer than half of them. Not rare, in other words, but not universal either. Somewhere squarely in between, which means a genuinely huge number of human cultures throughout recorded history bonded, fell in love, raised families, and built entire romantic traditions of their own, all without this specific gesture ever once being part of the picture. That single statistic alone should make you suspicious of anyone who tells you this behavior is simply hardwired into the species without exception. For a long time, the standing assumption in Western research was that romantic kissing represented a near-universal human instinct, hardwired directly into our biology from birth. The same way blinking or flinching is. When anthropologists finally went and checked that assumption systematically, across a genuinely wide range of documented societies worldwide, the actual picture turned out to be far messier than expected. Some cultures had no traditional concept of mouth-to-mouth kissing as a romantic gesture at all. And, according to several historical accounts from early contact between different cultures, some communities reportedly found the entire idea of it slightly strange, or even mildly off-putting, the first time they encountered other cultures that did practice it regularly. That doesn't mean those societies somehow lacked physical affection between partners. Far from it. In every documented case, it means the specific gesture of mouth-to-mouth kissing looks a lot less like some universal biological program running identically in every human being, and a lot more like a widespread but genuinely unevenly distributed cultural behavior, one that different societies either developed independently, on their own, adopted later through contact with others, or simply never picked up at all across their entire history. Some of the same researchers have pointed out that societies without a tradition of romantic kissing frequently have equally elaborate, equally intimate alternative gestures, extended nose-to-nose contact, prolonged embraces, or ritualized breath-sharing that carry the exact same emotional weight and serve the exact same bonding function within that culture, just wearing a completely different physical form. In several documented cases, missionaries and early travelers recorded genuine confusion or embarrassment from local communities upon first witnessing European-style kissing, a reaction that would be very difficult to explain if the behavior were actually some deeply hardwired universal instinct everyone recognized on sight. So, if it isn't a single universal instinct wired identically into every person, where does the actual behavior come from in the first place? One leading hypothesis points to something considerably older and far more practical: feeding. In several primate species and in a number of human cultures historically, mothers would chew food thoroughly to soften it, then pass it mouth to mouth directly to an infant too young to chew solid food on its own, a practice called premastication, still documented in a small handful of societies even today. Some researchers believe romantic kissing may have gradually evolved out of this much older, entirely non-romantic mouth-to-mouth bonding behavior between parent and child. later repurposed by adults into a completely different gesture of intimacy and trust between partners instead. Supporting this general idea, close mouth-to-mouth contact isn't a uniquely human behavior either. Primatologists studying bonobos, one of our closest living relatives on the evolutionary tree, have documented them engaging in mouth-to-mouth contact specifically as a social bonding behavior in its own right, entirely separate from feeding or reproduction, suggesting the underlying wiring for this kind of contact-based bonding may run considerably deeper in our shared primate ancestry than the specifically romantic version alone would otherwise suggest. Chimpanzees, another close relative, have been observed doing something similar after conflicts within the group, using mouth-to-mouth or mouth-to-body contact specifically as a reconciliation gesture, which fits neatly with the broader idea that this entire category of behavior evolved primarily to repair and strengthen social bonds, long before it ever became associated specifically with romance. If mouth-to-mouth contact already existed in our evolutionary lineage as a general-purpose bonding and reconciliation tool millions of years before modern humans existed, then romantic kissing looks less like an invention from scratch and more like one narrow, specialized application of a much older, broader behavioral toolkit our species inherited and then repurposed for its own specific social needs. The same way a much older tool sometimes gets picked up centuries later and used for a job its original makers never once imagined. Image style. Flat vector illustration of a simple parent and infant silhouette pair, gentle mouth-to-mouth feeding gesture, implied through soft proximity rather than explicit detail, warm and tender posture, minimal, flat shading, tasteful and non-explicit muted palette. Here's a stranger possibility, one that treats a kiss less like a simple romantic gesture and more like a hidden biological exam neither participant consciously knows they're sitting for. Close facial proximity gives each partner an unusually detailed read on the other's breath, scent, and subtle chemical signals, information that some researchers argue may subconsciously factor into deeper judgments about genetic compatibility, particularly around a group of immune-related genes tied directly to disease resistance. Kissing also triggers a genuinely measurable chemical exchange between two people. One well-known study found that saliva swapped during kissing carries detectable levels of hormones, including testosterone, and that the act of kissing itself reliably shifts levels of oxytocin, the bonding hormone, upward, while shifting cortisol, the primary stress hormone, downward in both partners simultaneously. In other words, whether or not either person consciously realizes what's happening, a kiss appears to function as a small, information-rich checkpoint, part chemical negotiation, part biological handshake, taking place well below the level of conscious thought or deliberate decision-making. Researchers studying attraction and compatibility have found that people frequently report a first kiss as a genuinely decisive moment in a new relationship, sometimes changing their feelings about a partner significantly in either direction, which fits neatly with the idea that something real and informative is actually being exchanged in that moment, well beyond simple physical pleasure. Some surveys on this exact question have found a striking share of respondents reporting that a single disappointing first kiss ended their interest in an otherwise promising relationship almost immediately, a reaction that seems disproportionate to a single physical gesture, unless something closer to genuine biological information gathering is actually taking place underneath it. For a long time, the popular theory held that romantic kissing began somewhere in South Asia and gradually spread outward from there, eventually reaching the Mediterranean world through contact during Alexander the Great's military campaigns centuries later. Then, in 2023, researchers re-examining Bronze Age cuneiform tablets from ancient Mesopotamia found clear written references to kissing in an explicitly romantic and sexual context, dated to roughly 4,500 years ago. Hundreds of years before the timeline the old spread theory had relied on to make its case. The researchers behind that discovery argued this finding likely means kissing wasn't invented in one single place and then carried outward like a slowly spreading trend at all. It's considerably more likely that the behavior emerged independently, multiple separate times, in multiple unconnected cultures scattered across the ancient world, which fits far better with the earlier finding that kissing shows up so unevenly across global cultures today, rather than following one clean, traceable line of cultural inheritance from a single point of origin. The tablets themselves describe kissing between partners in a matter-of-fact way that suggests the behavior was already thoroughly ordinary and well established in Mesopotamian society by the time anyone bothered to write it. Down, meaning its actual origins likely reach back further still, into a period with no written record at all to confirm exactly how much further. This is a pattern that shows up again and again across the history of human behavior. By the time something finally gets written down, it has usually already been quietly ordinary for generations. Which means every written first appearance date we have for a behavior like this should be read as a floor, not a true beginning. Picture the moment it actually happens. Tens of thousands of years ago. Tallow has been gone for 3 days on a hunting trip that ran considerably longer than planned, and there was real, genuine uncertainty back at camp about whether he'd return at all, let alone in one piece. He walks back into view at dusk, visibly tired, a little thinner than when he left, but alive. Ember, 2 crosses the distance between them faster than she consciously means to, breaking into a run before she's even decided to. There's no elaborate greeting ritual here, no words exchanged first, nothing formal about it at all. She reaches him, and their foreheads come together, a long pause settling over both of them, breathing each other in, checking. On some level, neither of them could ever fully put into words that this is really him, that he's genuinely safe, that whatever chemical signals happen to pass between them in that exact moment confirm what her whole body already desperately wants to believe. It isn't romantic in the specific way a modern audience might automatically picture it. It's relief, made fully physical, communicated the only way 2 people with no shared language for a feeling this large could realistically manage. Proximity, breath, direct contact. That instinct, to close the distance and confirm with your own senses what your mind is desperate to believe, is the exact same one still quietly running the moment you see someone you love walk through an arrivals gate at an airport today. Nobody standing in that camp would have had a word for what just happened between them. No term for relief, no term for bonding hormones flooding a nervous system in real time. They would only have known, with total certainty, that the distance between 2 people had just closed in the one way that actually mattered, and that whatever came next, words, food, rest, could wait a few seconds longer than it otherwise would have. Other members of the band, watching from a short distance away, understand exactly what they're witnessing without needing any explanation either, and quietly give the 2 of them a moment before the ordinary business of the evening resumes around them. Here's the turn. If romantic kissing wasn't actually a single universal instinct after all, but a behavior that emerged independently in some cultures and simply never developed in others, then how did it end up feeling so completely globally standard today, present in nearly every movie, every love song, every culture's modern media output? The honest answer has considerably less to do with ancient biology, and considerably more to do with 20th century media distribution at massive scale. As film, then television, then global internet culture spread specific cultures' romantic imagery around the entire planet at genuinely unprecedented speed and reach. The kiss became a kind of universal visual shorthand for "this is a romantic moment," adopted far beyond the specific cultures where it originally came from, in some documented cases, actively replacing older, locally specific gestures of affection that had served the exact same emotional purpose, just as effectively, for just as long beforehand. The underlying chemistry beneath the gesture, the oxytocin, the proximity, the checking-in instinct we walked through earlier, is genuinely ancient and shared by everyone. The specific idea that this particular gesture is the one correct way to show romantic love, everywhere, identically, is a much newer, much more manufactured kind of universal than most people walking around today would ever assume. It's worth noting how quickly this standardization actually happened. Historically speaking, within roughly a single century of mass cinema reaching global audiences, a locally specific gesture from a handful of cultures had effectively become the default romantic image exported and absorbed nearly everywhere else. A speed of cultural transmission that no purely biological instinct could plausibly explain on its own. Compare that single century to the tens of thousands of years the underlying bonding chemistry has existed, and the mismatch in timescale becomes almost impossible to ignore once you actually see it laid out side by side. You assume this specific gesture is pure instinct, wired identically into every human being who has ever lived. For a genuinely huge share of human history, entire cultures express that exact same love, that exact same relief, that exact same bone-deep need to confirm someone is safe, using a completely different physical gesture altogether, and it worked just as well every single time. You most likely learned the specific version you personally use from movies and screens, long before you ever actually tried it yourself with another person. They learned theirs from watching their own parents, their grandparents, an unbroken chain of specific, local, entirely valid gestures that never once needed a global film industry to spread them anywhere. The underlying chemistry beneath all of it, the oxytocin, the breath, the simple wanting to be close enough to truly know someone is really there in front of you, is ancient, and it's shared by every human being alive today. The specific choreography you've been quietly assuming is universal is mostly just the version that happened to own the movie screen for the last 100 years. Somewhere in a culture without a film industry of its own, right now, someone is pressing their forehead against a partner's, or touching noses in greeting, feeling exactly the same rush of chemical relief and connection you feel, using a gesture that will likely never make it into a single movie you'll ever watch. And that absence from the screen has never made the feeling behind it one bit less real, whatever the export statistics for that particular gesture happen to look like on paper. This has been Foxhole's Stories. The next time you lean in to say goodbye, you'll know exactly how much older and how much newer that simple gesture really is.